What's up, guys, and welcome to the first ever episode of Muscle Talk. I'm your host, Arash Rahbar, and I'm very proud to announce my first guest on the show ever, my good friend and fellow IFBB Pro, Chris Tuttle. Chris is a registered dietitian and has a master's in nutrition and is a very successful and well-known coach. Chris, I got to ask you about that shirt. Hashtag in Tuttle we trust. I'm loving that shirt. What's the story behind that?
Oh, my wife came up with that, and it's funny. It's like half the things that she comes up with, I don't even know until I see one of my clients wearing the shirt.
Okay,
So
so
she does marketing and stuff, and she does all bunch of crazy things behind the scenes that sometimes I'm not even aware of, but end up being really good ideas.
I love the shirt. It's a brilliant one. You should definitely wear that to the shows when you're backstage with the clients.
Yeah.
And any show that I ever go to on the East Coast, especially like the Metropolitans and the shows over here, I always see Chris running around backstage, taking care of his clients, and he's a real hands-on coach. So if you guys are looking for a hands-on coach and someone with a lot of background, a lot of knowledge, be sure to hit up Chris. I'll put his info down below. So Chris and I spoke briefly last week, and we put up a couple topics that we thought you guys would benefit from and would enjoy getting a little bit more detail and in depth and knowledge. We all know briefly on certain topics like pre, intra, and post workout nutrition. You hear a lot of guys just, I eat this, I eat that, cream of rice, whey protein, but we don't really know exactly why and how to optimize these meals. So our first topic is going to be pre, intra, and post workout nutrition. Second topic is going to be hypertrophy, some myths about hypertrophy and how to optimize muscle hypertrophy, building as much muscle as possible in the shortest period of time. And Chris, what was our third topic that we chose?
Third topic was
Eating enough for
thing.
right?
Yes.
So we had a
I was
lot.
thinking about
Yeah, it was really, really tough to come up with just three because we had so many great topics and so many of you guys commented on our posts and DM'd us. Thank you for that. If we have some extra time, we're going to address one or two of your questions. But the last topic was eating enough in the off season and not too much. So when do you know you're eating enough and when do you know you're eating too much? Of course, in the off season, we want to eat as much as we possibly can to get as strong and as big as we possibly can. But by big, I mean muscle mass, right? None of us want to get fat. There's a lot of negative things that come with putting on body fat. So without further ado, Chris, when it comes to pre-workout, intra-workout, and post-workout nutrition, whether it be shakes or meals or how to put these together, how do you go about doing that for yourself and for your clients to optimize that period of time and that window where we're training and doing our best to grow?
All right, so I'm gonna, I could spend a lot of time talking about these particular topics, especially pre, intra, and post workout nutrition. But I'm going to really address it as simplified as I can to be the most useful for people who are listening. Now, number one, when it comes to designing pre, intra, and post workout nutrition, clearly there's a huge individuality component that has to be considered. There is no cut and dry, black and white protocol that's going to fit all right, because you have varying digestibilities of what people can tolerate. You have varying degrees of goals for the individual. You have body type, meaning are they an individual that can't tolerate a lot of food or can? Then you have goals. Are they in prep? Are they out of prep? Are they coming out of a show? Are they training twice a day or once a day? So those are all individual things that need to be considered. So I'm going to give kind of general principles and ideas that people can use to build their pre, intra, and post-workout nutrition. So starting with pre-workout nutrition, now this is considering we're not training in a fasted state or like we have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and be training by 4 a.m. We're just talking about standard, normal pre-workout nutrition. So generally pre-workout, you don't want to have a lot of fat content in the meal, of course, because a lot of fat content, can delay gastric emptying, slow digestion, and make you feel a little bit longer, fuller for longer, where you might be burping up food during your workout. Now, defining that amount of fat obviously is going to vary, of course, from person to person. So if a girl is 5'1" versus like 6'5", they're going to have two different caloric requirements. So one might look like 5 grams of fat pre-workout. One might look like 15 grams of fat. But to some people, 15 grams of fat might seem like a lot, but it's not in retrospect to their caloric intake. So general rule of thumb, individuality-wise, I think fat should be included in the pre-workout nutrition, considering that it's 60 to 90 minutes prior training. The reason being is you do want to have some type of glycemic control, because fat delays gastric emptying, but also delays the rise in blood glucose from the carbohydrates consumed, because you don't want to crash in the middle of your workout. And some people like myself do that. If I had a large bowl of cream of rice and just protein and I go to train, I'm going to feel awful because it digests too fast for me, and then I'll get a crash.
Yeah, that happens to me often. And I feel like especially insulin sensitivity has gone up for me over the years with bodybuilding and muscle mass. And when I'm in my prep and I'm on low carb, that happens several times and it absolutely ruins my workout.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. So there's that individual component of fat that you have to consider, where there should be some fat, but not a lot. Now, moving to carbs pre-workout, you definitely want to have carbohydrates pre-workout, because that's going to be, somewhat your prime energy source. However, main primary energy source is really going to be glycogen in the muscle that has been stored previously from the nutrition from the day before. But obviously your body can still utilize fast digesting carbohydrates readily available within 90 minutes. So there's that component. Also, carbs spike insulin. So insulin being on the rise is sometimes arguably debatable, a good thing to occur when you're training for anabolism reasons or recoverability, so to speak. But you definitely want to choose, carbohydrates like white rice, cream of rice, maybe even cream of wheat, something easily digestible. It's lower in fiber. You don't want to sit there and consume 14 ounces of sweet potato, right? Or like a humongous cup of oatmeal and then go train.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure some people do that and they're fine. And then the amount of carbs, is, again, that's an individual thing, where you get a lot of people who have a large meal, they get tired because obviously digestion's occurring well over 90 minutes. And if you have a large meal, even if it is low in fat, higher in carbs, you can get tired and sleepy. So carbohydrates, in my opinion, pre-workout really should not be anything larger than your standard meal in your individualized plan. In some cases, you could even go slightly less if you're one of those people that has trouble digesting food fast or gets tired. So for example, say if you're normally eating 90 grams of carbs per meal, you could dip down to maybe 60 grams of carbs pre-workout within an hour, 90 minutes, or you keep it at 90. And then protein intake, people vary protein intake. I generally tell my clients, don't eat red meat prior training, because the majority of people have trouble kind of moving red meat right along within 60, 90 minutes prior training, especially if you're training something like legs where it's really physically demanding. So I usually tell them to do chicken or even sometimes whey protein or even eggs. I have never had any issues with eggs pre-workout. Egg whites or maybe a couple whole eggs, not an issue. But do you want to have the same amount of protein per meal? I'm one of those believers that protein intake should be relatively the same intervals throughout the day. It shouldn't be like 20 grams of protein for breakfast and then 80 grams pre-workout and then 100 post. I like to keep it even. So those are your components to pre-workout nutrition. And, I apologize if you guys are looking for really cut and dry answers. There just isn't any. And the best thing to do is to educate yourself on ins and outs of pre-workout nutrition and slowly individualize that to you based on your response. And Arash, I know that's something that you were saying to yourself, how you get insulin sensitivity gets so high that you need to make adjustments based on you going hypo during your workout, right?
Oh yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, it got to the point where I was a big believer of intra-workout carbs and fast digesting proteins, and I guess they were just digesting and absorbing so quickly that They were obviously, even though they're supposed to have a lot of a very quick gastric emptying, they were spiking my insulin. And I believe I'm a little insulin sensitive. I think I've always been like that. And when your insulin spikes and you have an abundance of insulin and it takes all the glucose, takes all the carbohydrates, either you use it for fuel or you store it in the muscle, whatever the case may be, there's none left. The insulin is still there and I go hypo. And that was one of the reasons I stopped having intra-workout carbs, because I was literally going hypo towards the end of my workout, which defied, what we learn and what makes sense, because it's the carbs shouldn't be making me go hypo.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. I felt the same way, believe it or not, with intra carbs and using even essential amino acids during workout, because people don't realize that whey protein and essential amino acids have a high insulin index, meaning the ability for your body to release insulin without obviously addressing blood sugar. So I was feeling awful in the middle of my workout, and I'm like, dude, I got to stop this. So I just started drinking water, and I felt fantastic.
Before we move on, I gotta point something out. Chris said something really, really valuable there. We all know the GI, the glycemic index. Everybody uses the glycemic index. All nutritionists use it, and the glycemic index is obviously an index, and each food is given a number based on the rate of digestion. But something that's very, very overlooked but very important is the insulin index. And Chris, can you tell them what the insulin index is?
All right, so insulin index is really the ability of certain foods to, have an insulin response really without addressing blood sugar. So to give you guys an example of what that might be, I don't remember what rice is exactly, but rice I think might be around 100. And then steak, red meat's 50, and butter is like 2. So even though, butter is a fat and red meat is not a carb, it still has an insulin response in the body. Chicken is like 30, fish is down to like 12. So as you can see, many people use fish for cutting because it has a decreased response to insulin in the body. So therefore, your body's more in that fat burning environment. Steak is great for building muscle because of that insulin index response. And of course, it's micronutrient density. But that's exactly what people overlook. Like when I was in school, we had to constantly tell diabetics that having whey protein is going to throw off their blood sugars. And I remember when I was there, I'm like, I don't get why is whey protein throwing off the diabetics' blood sugars? And then we learned about the insulin index and how it can change response to insulin they're using in their glycemic control. So that's something I think that, like you just said, that's highly overlooked and not many people understand it or know about it.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, there are certain foods that are low on the glycemic index, but relatively high in comparison on the insulin index. So it's for you hardcore dieters, the people that are trying to get sub 8%, and for you competitors, it's definitely something that I would take a few minutes or a few hours, if you have it, to read up on and look through. These are the things that I call real hardcore bodybuilders nerds, and all the real life practicing with training and nutrition and talking in the gym and all that is great, but you guys should always be doing your reading and listening to guys like Chris. So for the pre-workout nutrition, I totally agree with you. One thing that I have noticed, like oatmeal didn't always sit great with me in my stomach. But again, I don't eat a big portion. I have about 80 grams, which is about 55 grams of carbs. It's roughly about a cup. But one thing that I noticed, and it sounds really funny, is that it sits better in my stomach when I blend the oats. So I take quick oats dry and I blend them, almost making like an oat flour, and then I cook it, and it just digests much easier. And then I took it a step further and I did the same thing with my chicken. Instead of eating the grilled chicken piece by piece with a fork, I also would puree it. And my pre-workout meal is just like this puree. And it's a fairly large meal. It's 55 grams of carbs and 6 ounces of chicken, but it just sits really well with me. It doesn't bloat me. It doesn't upset my stomach whatsoever. Do you think that has any truth to it, or is that just like a placebo for me?
No, it has truth. In the hospital and dysphagia diets and things like that, you have different consistencies. So like usually bypassing the consistency of food is called mechanical alteration of it, which usually would be something that your mouth would do. You chew it up until it gets into, a paste then you swallow it, digestive enzymes in the mouth start breaking down the food, goes into your stomach. But yeah, of course there is. Now, and think about this too. It's like oats sometimes take a difficult time to cook and absorb the water to expand. So if you're blending it to a powder and then say you are cooking it, you are thoroughly cooking and making sure the fibers are slowly down, where mechanically your body has to work less hard to further break it down in the stomach before it goes in the small intestine. So I always tell people either way, which is funny, is because I'm a science guy, but I'm also an application guy, is who at the end of the day, who cares if science says yes or no? If you're having that positive effect, whether it's placebo or not, it doesn't matter. It's working, right? So like some people might have a very atypical, super strange response to the norm, but I'm not going to sit there and try to scratch my finger and try to figure it out and be like, well, if that's working, that's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
But no, I have done that in the past with certain foods, and I know certain individuals and my clients who do things very similarly, and it ends up working fine. Another person I had, which is kind of in the lines of what you're saying, is they had problems with their oatmeal. So I said to them, add a little bit more water than you normally cook it, because he wasn't using the same amount of water it calls for. And I go, use a little bit more water and put it in for an extra minute. And he did that, and digestion was great.
Oh,
So it's
wow.
like he was probably digesting some of the oats still raw,
Yeah.
and it wasn't absorbing. So when he cooked it a little bit more water, the body was more able to break it down, and he had no problem.
Yeah, there's so many variables. That's one thing that I've learned 26 years of bodybuilding is like the smallest little thing. So a lot of times I'll be experimenting strictly out of boredom, like the blending the oatmeal was kind of just like I was tired of eating the same thing and I just want to try something different, and it worked out. So I'll give myself credit for that one. Thanks for letting me know that was a smart thing to do. So moving on to intra-workout carb, intra-workout protein, just intra-workout fuel. Chris, if you're getting a solid meal pre-workout, proper meal to fuel your workout, and you have a post-workout meal planned or ready with you, regardless if it's in the gym or within an hour as you get home, is it necessary to take anything in intra-workout?
I'm going to get such backlash for this, but the answer is no. There's really no research supporting at all, especially in a weightlifter for us, unless you're using insulin and you're feeding insulin. Obviously,
Okay.
that's a different story. But like, there's been no benefit or increase in benefit of hypertrophy or increased body weight. And in some people have more detrimental effects because, say, I know people who are consuming 100 carbs pre, 100 carbs intra, and then 100 post. Your body feels like it's Thanksgiving. It's like you're driving blood to the muscle because you're exercising, but your body's also being like, no, 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 I need the blood in my intestinal tract to digest. And
Yeah.
then, of course, you get the placebo effect. If I tell John Doe intra workout with tons of carbs is the way to go and it's going to make him crazy, he's going to assume and think it's making him big and crazy.
Yeah.
When in reality, all these clinical studies show that's not the case. Now, some of the intra workout nutrition that I think we stole from was from Olympic athletes and cyclists, where they're consuming 1 gram of carb per minute. But these are elite cyclists performing near 90% VO2 max for an entire 90 minutes. So, like, obviously, they're burning way more calories than a bodybuilder is in an hour. And they did show a increased performance, decreased fatigue, decreased mental fatigue, and so increased protein synthesis and all these things. But what a lot of the guys need to understand, everybody who's listening, is sometimes things look great on paper, but they have zero application, where you're going to see no difference at all whatsoever. Maybe under a microscope, and you have this tiny percent difference, which might make a difference in Olympic athletes where 0.2 of a second matters. But when it comes to hypertrophy, in my opinion, it's the data's not there. One, my personal experience, it made me feel worse. And with my clients, I think I may have 3 of my clients do it just because they're hard gainers and they need to consume food constantly. But other
Yeah.
than that, man, I really don't think it's necessary.
I have to agree with you on this one. I almost feel like this is a good analogy to use. It's kind of like shoving your face with fast acting carbs backstage for a show. If you didn't carb up properly the days prior to the show, you're not going to fill up your glycogen stores with rice cakes, jelly, or whatever you're consuming backstage within minutes. So it very, very highly correlated to what we're talking about. If your nutrition throughout the day and your pre-workout nutrition is on point and consistent, it's not necessary. I mean, I think if somebody's pre-workout meal is like 3 hours before they train, then yeah, I think it'd be a good idea to have something maybe right before you work out or intra. But roughly, and another topic I want to talk about is spiking your insulin, but roughly about an hour, like you said, 60 to 90 minutes. I've experimented with, when I was younger, I used to eat and go straight to the gym, and that didn't always work out good. There's been times where I did about 60 minutes, where I leave the house half hour after I eat. By the time I get to the gym and warm up, it's about an hour. And there's been times when I'm in prep, I'm eating so little, I just want to let the most amount of time spread out through the meals, where I really took my sweet time to get to the gym. And sometimes I'd get to the gym an hour and a half after I ate the meal. And by the time I got moving and warming up, I was pushing close to 2 hours. So that meal gap would go a lot further, and make it easier for me throughout the day, because I wasn't eating that many meals and I wasn't eating that much food. But what about having insulin present? So not eating 2.5, 3 hours before your workout, but eating closer to the workout so you have insulin present. Is there any truth to that? Because one, if you're dieting and you're in contest prep, having insulin present can, if I'm not mistaken, keep you from going catabolic. And not only that, but insulin is the most anabolic hormone we have in our body. So do you want insulin present while you're training, or do you not want it present?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. Like, and one thing that, a lot of listeners will find out about me is if I don't know something, I'm going to say I don't know. Now, what I'm going to say is based on my own theory. I don't have any studies to reference. I don't have any hard data, just my own personal experience. Generally, if I feel that blood sugar is low or insulin levels are lower, I feel flatter. I don't have as much, I don't want to say oomph in the gym, as much power. I like to feel full. I like to feel kind of not puffy, but like full, like you're getting a pump easily. And whether that's associated with a higher amount of insulin or not, I think it might be. And that's my personal experience in my own theory. I do believe that there is some sort of importance there. Like, it's like, say, if you had carbs in all your meals and then you take away all carbs pre-workout, you might not feel the greatest, whether that's placebo and your workout's being affected because of how you feel, or whether there's something really going on hormonally with insulin and things like that is another story. But I do believe that there's some importance there. I just can't sit there and tell you and break it down for you by fact whether it is. I mean, obviously people know that there's an inverse relationship between cortisol and insulin. So if insulin's rock bottom, cortisol and stress hormones go up, glucagon goes up, try to raise blood sugar. So you have that fact. Then you have the other point that some people make is endogenous growth hormone is inhibited by spikes in insulin. When you weight train, you do get a spike of natural growth hormone release, endogenous. This is not for people who are taking exogenous forms of growth. So you guys can cool it on that. So if you're spiking the hell out of insulin's way up the entire time, you are inhibiting the release of growth, from what I understand, because there's but I mean, like, having enough carbs and having insulin spike and then having insulin slowly drop as you're training hard will still give you that rise in cortisol and release in growth hormone until you get your post-workout nutrition. So long story short, I do think it's important. Do I think people need to go crazy and pound 100 grams of sugar? I don't think people need to do that. But I do think that carbohydrates are important pre-workout, really, whether you're dieting for a show or in the off season.
Totally agree. And before we move on to post-workout nutrition, one thing I want to say, guys, is like, we've done so much reading. Chris, a lot more than me. I mean, he has a master's in this, and, there's so much that we've learned, and still there's so much we're uncertain of, because Again, there's many, many variables with every individual. And one thing that I have realized is overthinking and overanalyzing can honestly do you harm sometimes and drive you crazy. So absolutely listen to our show, ask questions, learn as much as you can, but just have faith in your plan. And as long as you're not messing up big time, as long as you're pretty much have a good program, your meals set up, and you're getting your meals in like we talked about pre and what we're going to talk about post workout, you're going to build muscle and you're going to grow. Sometimes we just like to debate and really, really get down to the nitty gritty, and we're splitting hairs at that time. So maybe if one thing is better than the other, how much better are we talking? Sometimes it might only be 10%, and it might not even be noticeable for until you're doing it consistently for 5 years. So moving on to post-workout. Post-workout is something people put a lot more emphasis on, and a lot of people are really, really OCD about it. They carry their meals with them in their backpacks. They have shakes like the second they put the dumbbell down on their last set. What's your take on post-workout? How important is it? What do you like as far as proteins and carbs for post-workout? And also the window. Is it immediate? Is 1 hour more effective than 2 hours? Is 2 hours more effective than 3 hours? Is 3 hours too late? I mean, is there that real anabolic window, or is that like a complete myth?
Well, the anabolic window, that time frame is actually not as important as once thought, where they used to say that you have to ingest 30 to 45 grams of protein within 30 minutes post-training to yield the strongest protein synthesis response. Now, this is just protein. This is not talking about carbs. Okay. So recent research has supported that even 60 minutes or even up to 90 minutes still yields a very, very strong protein synthesis response. However, going over 90 minutes, I believe, don't quote me, you start to have not diminishing returns, and you still have a protein synthesis response, just not as quite as strong as it was when you're in under that 90-minute window. Now, this is the other aspect of what people need to consider if you're trying to build muscle. If you're training, if you're eating 90 minutes pre-workout, and then you train for an hour and a half, and then you're waiting 90 minutes, you have all that time that went by, so you couldn't possibly be eating 6 meals a day, because who's awake for 20 hours, right? So people ask me all the time, geez, why do you bring your post-workout meal to the gym? I heard the window's not that important. It's not that important. I just don't want to be up to 11 o'clock at night eating all my. So I'm going to eat when I'm ready, post-workout, take my time and go. So it's not like I'm doing it because I have to nail that anabolic window. Absolutely. It's just because of timing of the day, and I need to get back to work.
Yeah.
But protein amount, I believe 45 grams of protein, between 35 and 45 grams of protein had the strongest response. And when you went more than 45, there wasn't any dose-dependent effect. So like the biggest, strongest response was between like 35 and 45. And then after that, didn't yield a stronger and stronger effect. Didn't mean it wasn't going to be utilized.
Are we talking about?
Means there wasn't a.
I'm sorry. Are we talking about effective protein synthesis or insulin?
Protein synthesis. And then now regarding carbs, this is interesting too. Carbs did not have a increased proteins. Like when you have a carb with a whey protein, it didn't really make it 100 times better or better. Just consuming protein and then having a balanced meal 90 to 2 hours after really showed no difference in the group that was consuming protein and carbs right away post-workout, showing that the most important thing is easy digesting protein post-workout than, people being like, I have to have like 200 grams of carbs.
Okay.
And now about post-workout nutrition is how many carbs, right? I still believe that the amount of carbs post-workout should be consistent with your meals that you're eating or a little bit more. It should be like quadruple the amount, because then you're going to get a humongous spike in insulin, and then you're going to get a huge drop in insulin. Then you're going to get super tired and lethargic. You might go hypo, and it might send a whole cascade of irregular, poor glycemic control the entire day. If you want to control body fat and maximize protein synthesis, you do want to have some sort of control over your blood sugars.
So As far, okay, we know you don't want to have steak and you're not trying to have some very, very heavy, high fibrous meal or high fat meal post workout because you don't want slow digesting and gastric emptying. But how fast do you really need this meal, the protein and the carbs to digest? Are we talking about is hydrolyzed isolate and straight dextrose glucose Gatorade ideal, or is white rice and chicken breast going to cut it? And also, one other question one of our viewers commented on, I thought it was a really good question to include, is should he avoid fat post workout? You there, Chris?
Yeah, you are. You just broke up for a second.
So how important is it to have the fastest digesting carb post workout? Is it really, really important to have very fast digesting protein and carbs? We know not to have steak and high fibrous carbs because it's just super slow and it's heavy on the stomach. But how important is it? Are we talking chicken and rice is good enough, or chicken and cream of rice, or do we need to go dextrose, straight glucose carb source, and hydrolyzed whey isolate for the protein source? And another thing to throw on top of that, one of our viewers asked, I thought it was a great question to include, was should he stay away from fat in his post-workout meal? We talked about fats in pre-workout, but what about post?
All right. So the two factors that determine what carbs you should consume post workout, in my opinion, is one, are you training twice per day? If this is your first training session, I do believe that the post-workout nutrition should have some type of very fast digesting carbs so you can start the recovery process to be able to train again later, 4 to 8 hours or whatever that might be. The other aspect is how you feel generally after you train. Some people don't have an appetite at all. So like consuming rice and chicken post-workout is something they do not want to do. Could you imagine like doing a crazy high volume leg workout with intensity, and then you're like, so put some steak and potato in front of you, you know? So in that case, I always tell people, I'm like, you consume something that's simple, that's easy on your digestive tract, because blood is still obviously pooling in your legs at that point. But I don't think people need to go crazy with like dextrose. I think cream of rice and things of that nature, of that glycemic index and load, are fine. I'm not a big believer in sugars and really, really crazy spiking your insulin insanely fast. Like, doesn't need to be insanely fast,
Yeah.
You want to have good digestibility, of course, but digestibility and spiking insulin ability are two different things. I mean, even sometimes sugar can really mess up your stomach. I know a lot of people know what I'm talking about with that.
Yeah.
And then fats, and that is another individual thing. Obviously, if you're consuming a meal that is, say, wholesome, having some fat in the meal is important to absorb the fat soluble vitamins you might be consuming. And the other aspect is if you have very, very poor glycemic control, say, for example, you're a police officer or you're a construction worker and you train in the morning and then you're doing your post-workout meal and it's straight sugar, and then you can't eat for 2 hours later, and then you're going hypo like 60 minutes after your post-workout, but you're at work. So in that case, you might need to change your carbohydrate source or add 5-10 grams of fat to slow that glycemic response down. The reason why people don't put a fat in post-workout is because people, there's this theory, because it's not true to this extent, where they say if you have a lot of fat and a lot of carbs together and you have a phenomenon in the body with you get insulin resistance. It's not exactly entirely true. If you're having 10 grams of fat with 50 grams of carbs post-workout, you're not going to become insulin resistant. If you have a tremendous amount of triglycerides in the blood, that might be a different story. But in that case, it's not going to happen. So having a little bit of fat, I think, is important, but it would be consistent with what you're doing in the day if you're one that goes hypo. And then the other aspect is if you're eating a wholesome meal, you might want to have a little bit of fat to have the ability to absorb those fat soluble vitamins faster. But I don't think people need it. I generally have my clients have lower fat on the post-workout meal. And then in some cases, I pull it. But I don't want people going hypo. They go hypo, then they panic, and then they go, oh my God, I eat a whole box of English muffins and I had to slam honey and orange juice. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, you didn't need to consume another 800 carbs to prevent yourself from going hypo. You need about 15 grams of carbs, guys.
You know,
15 in the
even
hospital.
even
In the
protein.
hospital, man. What's that?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but even just lean protein has helped me come out of being hypo. A very little piece, you know. I think people overdo
Yeah.
it. I understand going hypo is the worst feeling ever. I mean, I get shaky and I sweat and it's just terrible. You know, growing up, I did the dextrose, the high carb. I'm talking about 60 to 80 grams of carbs post workout, and that was a lot for then. I wasn't as big as I am now. With whey protein, and the whole big thing was the insulin spike. The insulin spike. The biggest insulin spikes you're going to get are first thing in the morning, breaking a fast at breakfast, or after anaerobic activity, after weight training. So we were trying to take advantage of that insulin spike, store as much of the glycogen as we could in the muscle, help repair, recover. And then we'd also take in the creatine in that meal, which I still do. I still do that. I believe that creatine, ideal time to take it is with the post-workout meal. And we also used to have a glucose uptake, GDA, you know, so a disposal agent. What do you think of that? I mean, that's something that guys have been doing for like 30 years.
I guess I think it's an individual case. If you're having a little bit of insulin resistance, blood sugars are trending higher, you're consuming a lot of food, you're not gaining weight. I think GDAs might have an application. I can't take GDAs at all. I will go hypo immediately, constantly. I've been down that road many times, experimenting in the off season. It doesn't work for me. I don't have that problem. I'm insulin sensitive all of the time. So in my case, it was making me worse. But I think that's an individual thing. Like I said, if you're not gaining weight, and your blood sugars might be trending higher, you think you might be insulin resistant or are, I think those are great application and they can work. But they're only going to work if there's a problem. I think sometimes people start loading up on supplements when they don't have the issue that the supplements are addressing.
Good point. Okay, so moving on to our second topic, we're only two topics in, and we're over 35 minutes. I knew this would happen. So, going on to our second topic, muscle hypertrophy. I mean, muscle hypertrophy. First of all, you cover what it is exactly, but most importantly, for me at least, what I've come across over 2 decades of training is every time someone says muscle hypertrophy, they're talking about training. They're talking about a rep range, and the rep range that I feel has been paired with that word is 8 to 12, you know, around 12 reps, a little bit more is going to create muscle hypertrophy. And I don't believe this to be true anymore. After years and years of research and reading and learning and also training, I've grown doing half of that volume. There was years where I trained very hard, 4 to 6 reps. I ate very, very well. My post-workout nutrition, the rest of the day was on point, consistent, and I got big. You know, I grew. I was growing by the month. So I tend to believe that muscle hypertrophy, by definition, is basically putting the muscle under a new stress, right? Putting the muscle under duress, putting it under a new form of stress, forcing it to adapt, all while feeding it properly to create protein synthesis, and together you create growth in the muscle hypertrophy. What is your take on this? I mean, I feel like there's so many myths on how to grow and create hypertrophy in a muscle.
Yeah, well, I believe, and I'm pretty sure actually that the traditional repetition ranges were based on hormonal response in the blood. So, like, you know, people say 4 to 6 is for strength, 6 to 10 is for hypertrophy, 10 to 15 is for endurance. They were more looking what was going on in a physiological, hormonal, and cellular level. It wasn't really looked at as in like what's happening over 12 months of time while training under these repetition ranges. Now, recent research has stated that rep range is much less important in training the muscle to failure or near muscular failure is what's most dependent on muscular growth. But they're also saying that frequency and building volume over time, because there has to be some sort of increased stress over time as your body adapts to keep that growth process going, you know?
Yeah.
So frequency and volume seem to be catching more light. Now, obviously, guys, this is just based on current research. It could change again in 10 years. But basically, what we do know in personal experience and what Rosh has just said, that intensity is really what's really most important. And I think the other thing that people don't understand either or grasp is recoverability. You can't train every day. There's freaks that can do it. We all know them. But like you got to be able to really monitor recoverability. Like because your biceps not growing doesn't mean you train it every other day, you know? Um, but that's really the story in rep range. And actually, even tempo, people go, oh, you got to go slow, 3-1 tempo, 2-1 tempo, 4-1 tempo, 2-2, whatever. Tempo is less important either. What's most important is having control of the weight. So, like we see this all the time. And I would probably say 90% or more people in the gym, especially men, are pushing weight way heavier than they're supposed to because they're using momentum. They're compensating by arching their back, using different leverage points and muscles to try to lift a weight bigger than their muscle group they're trying to train can actually handle. And that in itself hinders your ability to grow because now you're incorporating 10 muscles to do a chest press versus just a lesser degree, few of them. Because in bodybuilding hypertrophy, you're trying to isolate a muscle to grow. You're not trying to become a weightlifter or a powerlifter where you're maximizing leverage points and using muscles as a group to lift the most amount of weight.
And so, what about food? I mean, is hypertrophy just about training? Is it just about the intensity and stress you put? Or, I mean, can you create muscle hypertrophy with inadequate nutrition?
Well, think about it. You can to a degree, right? So, like, you have the sedentary individual who we all have seen this before. And obviously, there's a huge genetic component in this because you have terrible genetics. You're born a Volkswagen Beetle. You can't expect to ever become a Ferrari, no matter how much time, effort, and money you put into it. But like, for example, if you have decent, yeah, it's true. If you have decent genetics and you haven't weight trained at all ever, and you start weight training on a caloric deficit, your body's going to put on some lean tissue. It's a normal adaptation. But then it's going to come to the point where that lean tissue just stops. And to get further lean tissue above and beyond what your body is at that point, you're going to need a surplus of calories. There's no question. How much surplus do you need? People say 200 to 500 calories more per day. But at the end, to determine how many calories extra you might need, say, to put on lean mass, is really going to be taking pictures, biofeedback markers, body fat percent, doing body fat caliper tests weekly to make sure you're not just getting fat. Strength tests, appetite, recoverability, soreness. So those are all things that you need to be come into play when you're determining, the amount of extra food you might need as an individual to grow.
Absolutely. I think that what you mentioned is really, really important. And again, I sound like a broken record, but extremely overlooked. Rest. This is something that I've struggled with, and I still struggle with. I believed in resting a lot. I learned early on when I was younger that you need to rest a lot, take a day off every 2 to 3 days. But once I started competing, even worse when I turned pro, there was, I think in 2017, getting ready for the Olympia, I trained 7 days a week. And as far as you might be able to. I can train a muscle for 3-4 hours or more. I can train 7 days a week, but it's not about if you can do something. It's about if this something is going to yield you the results you want. And you can't grow optimally if you're not recovering. And it's like you have a cut on your hand and it scabs up, right? And if you pick at that scab, well, it's gonna scab again, and it won't recover until you leave it alone. If you keep picking the scab, it'll just stay a wound forever. So one big thing was just resting, and especially if you're training really intense and really heavy like Chris and I do, regardless of your rep range, I'm talking about intensity. Your body just cannot recover in time to train a muscle in 2 days. Now, I believe you can train every muscle every single day like a gymnast, but you cannot bodybuild. Bodybuilding, we're physically tearing the tissue apart and waiting. I mean, I'd say a minimum of 5 days. Do you agree, Chris? 5 to 7 days?
Yeah, and obviously it's volume dependent too. So say if you're doing, just for example, throwing a number out there, 12 sets of chest, 12 sets of chest, you could, in theory, split it 6 sets Monday, 6 sets Thursday. It's still 12 sets in 7 days, and then build volume from that point in time. But I mean, I've always trained one body part a week for the entire 15 years of me bodybuilding. And I put on, the first time I stepped on stage was 174 with poor condition. And then the biggest I ever stepped on stage with good condition was 218. So I built that muscle with that bro training split, so to speak.
Yeah.
I've never done body parts twice per week before. I've started to now, but with a very lower volume with certain things. But it's all about recoverability. And people go, well, how do I know I'm recovering? Like, well, if you're excessively sore greater than 2 days, 3 days, you have delayed onset muscle soreness, and that's chronically happening, that's not good. If you're sore for 1 day, 2 days, that's fine. But if you train chest on Monday and your chest is still sore on Thursday, Friday, Saturday that week, you did too much.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, what comes with that is, if you're not getting stronger, you're not getting bigger, you feel achy, lack of pumps, appetite might be high, have trouble sleeping. Those are all signs of overtraining, the body being really stressed. And that's one thing people, I think, need to look more into, are the biofeedback markers of slow recovery or lack thereof.
Absolutely. Some people will sit there and think, well, I'm doing 120-pound dumbbells on chest. Of course, I'm going to get bigger and grow. Well, not necessarily. If you've been doing 120 pounds for the past few years, that's not necessarily a new stimulus, a new stress in the body. Bodybuilding is a progressive sport, guys. You need to be increasing one of three things progressively week by week, either the load, the weight with you train with, the volume that you're training with, or the intensity. You're not going to get stronger every single week, and you might not go up in reps every single week. Maybe you stay the same weight for the same reps, but you just do it with more control, a slower negative, or more intensity.
Yeah.
But one of those three things needs to increase on a weekly basis. And if not, then you're doing the same thing you did the week before and the month before. You're not going to yield new results. Our bodies do not want to be 200 plus pounds, under 5% body fat. We're forcing it to adapt to what we want. And again, bodybuilding is an adaptation. And if you're not bringing a new stimulus or a new reason, better said, a new reason to make it grow, it will not grow.
Arash, I just want to touch on something before we close this out. You said something perfect. If you start to use better form and technique and train like a bodybuilder and less like a weight, in theory, your weights might stall because your technique, your form and control is better. For example, I used to be able to do 4 or 5 for 3 or 4 reps at flat bench, and my chest was garbage. My chest is significantly bigger now after a pec tear, and I can't even come close to doing that weight now. And I remember during that time, there was a guy in my gym who had the most crazy chest I think I've ever seen when I was younger. And I look at him, I go, how do you build a chest like that? And he looks at me and he goes, dude, you are moving the weight. I'm working the muscle. I'm like, I don't get it. And he goes, and he came over and he put like 225 in the bar. And he goes, come over here. And he showed me and he put made it harder. And he made 225 feel like it was like a bulldozer. But the next day, my chest was lit up much more than it was just like banging 315 off my chest. So from that point forward, I'm like, oh, I got to rethink this. And then when I started to change my trainings, actually when I started winning shows, and then I turned pro a year later.
That's brilliant. I always say it's not what you do, but it's how you do it. Everybody's looking at Ronnie Coleman for what does he train with doing back? Arnold Schwarzenegger, what does he train doing chest? There's only so many exercises for each body part. We all do the same stuff. It's not what you do, it's how you go about it and how you do it. And that's a really good point. You were lucky to meet that guy in the gym because, the sooner in our careers, in our lifetime, in the sport of bodybuilding, we learn that simple fact, the sooner we're going to progress and also less likely to get injured. A lot of my bumps. A lot of my bumps
exactly.
Definitely from ego. I'm not going to lie. Like, I've never been a sloppy lifter by any means, but if I tell you that it doesn't feel better when I put on 5 plates on each side versus 3.5 plates, I'd be lying, But guys, don't forget, when you're walking down the street or you're on the beach with your shirt off, it doesn't say 500-pound bench press on your arm. It doesn't say 600-pound squat. It's all about the physique. And that's what bodybuilding is. We're here to build our physiques. We're not weightlifters. We're not just moving a weight from point A to point B. We're trying to move a weight from point A to point B using and isolating the best of our ability a given muscle for maximum growth. So, you got to keep that in mind. And injuries, man, these younger guys don't know how good they have it. What kills me the most at certain times, and even now in my off season, I'm in pretty good health, but I have more to give. I know I can push harder. I know I could go a little bit heavier or an extra few reps, but a certain injury will hamper me, and there'll be a little bit of pain, and it'll stop me from pushing. So until you really feel that pain and you get to that point where you might have a tweak, I hope none of you do, but until you get to that point, you really don't appreciate it.
No. Yeah, two things to close this out on this. One, a training program is only as good as the execution of the movements. Two, we're all one injury away from being done bodybuilding forever. Oof. If you look at a lot of the top bodybuilders, Roddy Coleman, Jay Cutler, a lot of Dennis Wolf, why did they stop? Injury. Yeah. So a lot of people have been completely had to stop bodybuilding during the AIDS because their body started breaking down. And like you just said, Arash, you don't know it until it's gone.
Yeah. I hated the way that just sounded, seriously, but I needed to hear it. So thank you again, Chris, for being on the show. We still have one more topic and another question, so we're going to have to do this again soon because we're nearing an hour. I appreciate you being on the show. Guys, thank you for watching. Thank you for all the questions and all the comments that you guys gave us leading up to this show. I hope you guys found it informative. Please make sure to follow Chris. I will post all his information down below. Comment on this video. Tell us what you liked and tell us what you'd like to hear us next time. Chris, if you have the time and you're willing to, I'd love to have you back on the show, brother.
Absolutely, man. We can make this a regular thing. Call some good topics.
Absolutely, man. It was a pleasure. Thank you again. Till next time, guys.
Awesome.
That was